I'd like to talk about two experiments in building Republican communities, one in France in the late 18th century and one in America in the early 19th century. And I want to suggest that both these experiments were bound to failure and that they were bound to fail for principled, if also practical reasons. So what happens when you build a community as a means to establishing Republican freedom and virtue? Well, what it means is that basically what you're trying to implement the principles of republicanism, in particular the principle of freedom, and in the 18th and 19th century, that would have meant also freedom from non-domination. So there would have been to be a certain class structure that modeled equality. Now, the experiments I'm looking at actually failed for practical reasons. One because everyone died, and the other one because of a sex scandal. But what I want to argue in this talk is that they would have failed anyway because they used structures and dynamics that belonged to colonization, and that was in fact incompatible with the Republican principle of non-domination that they tried to model. So is a Republican colony an oxymoron? Well, in the 18th century, republicanism placed a great emphasis on civic virtues as well as freedom from domination. And as Brissot remarked in the preface to his New Travels to America, the French in 1792, when he published the book, did not need to learn from America how to acquire freedom because they'd already done that. But they needed to know how to maintain it through virtue. Now, the two Republican communities I look at consisted of small groups of self-described virtuous Republicans taking it upon themselves to teach a community of peasants, in one case, and slaves in the other, Republican virtues and freedom. Now, it's hard to see how that could not involve domination, and in fact, we'll see that it did. So let's look at the first of these communities, and this is a community that was started by Jacques-Pierre Brissot. In fact, it wasn't started. So it was planned by Jacques-Pierre Brissot in collaboration with Marie-Jeanne or Manon and her husband, Jean-Marie Roland. Now, Brissot's community first was going to be in America. He had an American dream, like many in late 18th century France. He traveled to America just before the revolution in 1788, and he went there to observe the Republic, and especially the Quakers and their abolitionist views. And he published his travel book after the revolution, so he came back in 88, then he did the revolution, then he published his book in 1792. And in the preface, he wrote that we have no need to learn from Americans how to attain the blessings of liberty, but we have to learn from them the secret of preserving it. So his worry was that the French would lose liberty, and as in fact they did very quickly, because they didn't know how to preserve it. And the secret to preserving it, he figured out when he went to America, was virtue and using reason in everyday life. So the French, because they acted immorally, he thought, were basically calling tyranny back. So he decided to start a community. At first he wanted to try his luck in America, but then the revolution happened in France, and so he thought, well, we might as well try it here. And the idea was to start a community in rural France. So he would buy some land that had belonged to the clergy and had been kicked out, so the land was put up for sale cheaply. He first approached two revolutionary friends, Bosc and Lantenas, and they introduced him to the Roland couple, Marie-Jeanne, or Manon, and Jean-Marie. Both were ardent Republicans, and they lived in the countryside. They lived near Lyon, so they had a good grasp of what needed to be done when buying land. So Marie-Jeanne Roland and Jacques-Pierre Brissot became very close friends and collaborators. He published some of her work in his newspaper, and it's through him that she first became the influential figure that she was in the French Revolution. So working together, the Brissot and the Roland and Lantenas came up with a plan for their community. The first step was to buy up the land, and that land had to be fertile. It had to be close to a source of water, and it had to be close to a good road so that they could travel to and from it easily. The idea would be to start by building simple but comfortable houses for themselves, and then smaller ones for the purpose of housing 20 farming families. And then once they were settled, they would work on improving the farmers and their family by educating them and teaching them Republican values following Rousseau's model. And they said they would teach the purest morals, the simplest religious beliefs, and how to work with their hands. And on the other hand, they would regenerate themselves by learning how to work the land. So Brissot and his friends would be regenerated by the experiment, and the others would be educated. So here's what remains, or the first patch of what remains of their plans. You see, they called the experiment Société Agricole ou d'Amis, so Amis meaning friends, which was a reference to Quakerism here. And also they were actually friends. Now the Brissot Society failed because it didn't actually start. They started planning in 1789, then they did the revolution, and then they all died. And here's a picture of what may or may not be their bones in the French catacombs in Paris. So this was going to be, in a sense, a Republican colony. So the plans show that the community, although it was meant to develop Republican values and virtues and help them grow, first within the community and then throughout France, did not in fact exemplify these values. The teachers were the ones who were the real citizens of the community. The peasants were there to be molded by their teachers before they could pretend to any sort of equality of status. And in fact, there was no equality even once they were educated, because they weren't going to be educated to the same level. They were going to get a simple, pure education. But the teachers themselves were to make sure that they carried on being philosophers. In fact, part of the plan involved having a very big library for their own use. So the French status was going to be privileged throughout, and that went count as the very first principle of the French Republican Constitution, the abolition of privileges. Right, so let's move on now quickly to the second experiment that I want you to look at. Fanny Wright, or Frances Wright, was a Scottish Republican thinker. And even though she was born after the French Revolution, she was tied to it first through affinity. She was a great admirer of the revolution, but also because she became a very good friend in her mid-20s to Lafayette, the hero of the two revolutions. But she was actually quite keen on the American Republic, because unlike the French one that had taken, that was still around when she was alive, and she traveled to America at the age of 23 with her sister to observe the Republic. And she liked very much what she saw. She saw in America freedom, and she saw it everywhere, not just in theory, but in the way people related to each other. But she also saw, of course, that not everyone got to benefit from that freedom. So slaves in particular, and to some extent women, were still being left out. And she thought something had to be done. So a few years after her first trip to America, she returned there again with her sister and also with Lafayette to introduce her to the beau monde in America. And in 1825, she bought some land in Tennessee, land that had belonged originally to the Chickasaw people. And she founded the community of Nashoba with her sister Camilla. So the purpose of the community was to educate slaves and teach them a trade so that they could be freed. So why, you may ask, do slaves need to be educated before they can be freed? Well, she was actually addressing a very largely held view that slaves would not know what to do with their freedom if they were offered it. So basically, if you free a slave, the slave will just become a criminal, lazy layabout. That was what people thought. And the other prejudice that was very widely spread was that slaves didn't actually want to be freed, that they didn't understand freedom, and that they weren't capable of valuing it. So Wright both combated and shared this prejudice. She thought that it was ridiculous to think that anyone would not want to be freed. and she wanted to demonstrate it. But she also did believe that in order to enjoy freedom, people would have to be educated. So she said to give liberty to a slave before he understands its value is perhaps rather to impose a penalty than to bestow a blessing. So she shared in that prejudice to some extent. Here's a picture of Nashoba, which, as you see, didn't get to be developed very much. There's only very few buildings that got to be built, and the land was hard to work. And the atmosphere was such that it was actually hard to stay healthy there as well. So it was a big failure. It only lasted 5 years. She started running it with her sister, and then they introduced somebody called James Richardson. And then because she got very sick, she decided to travel to Europe after a while for her health and also to go and spend time with her friend or lover. And she left Camilla and Richardson in charge as a community. Now, whatever they got up to, what Richardson did that was not a good idea was to publish an account of how he and Camilla were running the place, and that resulted in sexual scandal. So the experiment ended in 1830, 5 years after it started, and the slaves were freed and shipped off to Haiti to try their luck there. So I contend that even if it hadn't been for the sex scandal and the bad health, the experiment would have failed, and it would have failed on principled ground, because it was trying to do something at the same time as it was very much not doing it. So more even than the Brissot experiment, and the Nashoba experiment relied on an imbalance of status between the leaders and the subjects. So in order to conduct the experiment, Wright actually went and bought 10 people, slaves, and these people were not freed until the end of the experiment, and they were only going to be freed on condition of fulfilling the educational demands of their mistress. And these educational demands actually involved a lot of hard labor. So the plan of teaching the love of liberty to slaves so that they may be free was probably never going to work out. That was the fundamental failure in the system, and pretty much the same as in the Brissot-Roland system. So let's look just briefly about why that wasn't going to work out. Well, let's go back to Mary Wollstonecraft, who said in The Vindication of the Rights of Woman that it is vain to expect virtue from women till they are in some degree independent of men. So what does she mean here? Well, she means that for anyone to be able to work on their own character, to develop the virtues, they need to be, first and foremost, they need to be their own person. They need to be able to think for themselves. They need not to be dominated by anybody else. They need to be able to choose for themselves that they're going to try and become virtuous. And if they're dominated, they can't make that choice for themselves. They're only making a choice that somebody is imposing on them, or they're making a choice only understanding that they may have to quit working on that as soon as their master tells them to. So the principles of the 18th century Republicans was very much in favor of that. Most of them believed that you could not improve your character without being free first, or at least you could try, but it was much less likely that you would succeed. So any project that involved the betterment of dominated individuals so that they may be freed is therefore fundamentally flawed. And this, which I've tried to show very quickly in this talk, is what was happening in the Brissot, Roland and the Frances Wright experiments.